Foreign direct investment driving development. Sustainable growth through knowledge transfer. Technology as a solution. Innovation as a way forward. Over 70 ministers, 140 countries, over 500 exhibitors, 8,000 square meters of exhibition, 15,000 businessmen and investors. The annual investment meeting, Sustainable Development through FDI-induced innovation and technology transfer.
Before entering into the discussion with this high-level delegation and high-level delegates from across the world, I would like to ask Mr. Alexander Banz from Nitin Capital Partners to briefly outline his ideas and his view on FDI and technology transfer. Alexander is an expert in the field of investment and corporate finance. He's actively involved in investing and setting up companies and joint ventures in growing economies. And he has 25 years of experience in private equity, venture capital, and has always been active in the triangle of strategy, finance, and technology. Now I'm a little worried because I don't see Alexander. I was already expecting you at the speakers, but well, a round of applause for Mr. Alexander Banz and his.
Thank you, Joachim. Usually, keynote speaker starts with laying out what the facts are and then give an opinion how it should be. And in this case, I want to just give you a bit of a insight in my personal business life. And when NASA asked me to speak here, this topic I want to highlight is something I'm struggling with every day, and it has a lot to do with growing economies and with young tech companies. So we've heard a lot about FDI and large multinational companies, and I think in those numbers you probably don't see at all anything that happens on the smaller scale with the younger companies. So let's think about also the area where I'm quite specialized in, which is in sustainable technologies, has a lot to do with clean tech, energy, waste, etc. If you look at where I get really energy from is walking in the countries like here, or where I spend a lot of my time in Asia, a bit in North Africa, but growing economies where you see there's growth. And you see immediately the impact that it has on the resources, on water, energy, on the construction. And it is nice to see that you see I feel when I speak to people, they would like to immediately leapfrog and use newer technologies. So bear in mind, just on one hand, we think about a demand from growing economies. They have to do it. They have to use newer technologies. And one thing I would like to mention before we've touched yesterday, people touched upon on solar, and how I'm a huge proponent of solar. And I just want to mention one thing, since people talk about efficient use of energy and how you can make energy cheaply. Just for your information, I heard people still saying, oh, solar is still very expensive. And I just want to give you an example, which is a live case. Unfortunately, we have somebody from Portugal. I'm looking at the solar plant in Portugal, 100 megawatt. Construction price under €1 per watt. That's where it's going now in Europe, and it can be definitely cheaper and more attractive also in growing economies. And where does it lead to? It leads to actually that you can produce energy. The deal in Portugal would be for 5 a kilowatt hour. Just bear in mind. It's not, and why is the price like that? It has depending on who's the off-taker. So if you're from a growing economy, really, it's a bit of a sidestep, but think about solar. It's not the technology cost that's the problem. It really comes down now to who are the counterparties in a deal. So when I'm in these countries, I really get energy from all the opportunities. Now, where I also get energy, but get slightly depressed, is when I'm in Europe. in Switzerland, there's not a lot of economic growth. You may see some homeless private bankers on the street nowadays, but it's just a bit of it's a boring place at the moment in Europe. And I've been quite involved with the tech tour scene and organized a very large clean tech summit. I've been doing it several years, and this year again. And you see all these companies, and they offer great technologies, but there's hardly any investment going into them. And that's, you have to understand what's going on with the investment climate at the moment in Europe. People say, oh, you know, incubators, and after the incubators, it's true, there's quite a bit of governmental money going into incubators and seed funds. But look for a venture capitalist with money in Europe. Look for it. They are kind of the walking dead. In the US, it's slightly better because the returns have been better. But if you are a venture capitalist and you want to raise a $100, $200, $300 million fund, especially on the clean tech side, you're going to end up and you go to a pension fund because, you know, that's the value chain of money. You know, it starts, you know, a small company, growth company raises money from a venture capital fund, but hey, the venture capital fund has to raise money from, say, pension funds who are limited partners. Well, you come to the meeting as a venture fund, and there you have this 32-year-old analyst working at the limited partner. He looks up the league tables, like, okay, well, how's European venture capital doing the last 10 years? And you get to a pretty horrible, shocking statistics. So therefore, venture capital is not getting a lot of money itself. And therefore, it is very hard for companies in Europe, especially, at least I know you're from the US, so you know that better, but it's definitely hard in Europe to grow as a young, innovative company. If you then add the sustainable side to it, and you think about waste, energy, heating and cooling, you add actually those type of technologies. Those are not a smart app that you develop with a couple million and it goes viral and you're a gazillionaire, you know? You need there to put money to work to make sure that these industrial processes are well run, well designed, well documented, well tested. And that's the type of venture capital that actually is not being liked as well at the moment in Europe. So, on one hand, I'm getting a bit sad when I see that, that situation. But being involved myself with some of these companies, I get extremely excited to the opportunities that's here. So what we've done at the firm, we've went through the database of all the clean tech and sustainable companies we knew. We had a list of 500-600 of them. Then we ranked them, we just categorized in them. And then we came to, because you know, not all technologies are well suited to be exported or not exported or to find deals or to work in grown countries. So we found around 50, we interviewed quite a few of them. And then my question was like, listen, I've been a lot to the Middle East, to other places, and I get energy, you know. They have a need. What can we do there? And you would be surprised that you speak with a lot of these entrepreneurs and they say, well, Jesus, if I'm gonna tell my board members that they don't have enough money to grow here locally, to buy tickets and go to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, you know, come on guys, you know, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna get burned. But the sad thing is that they don't see that if you have an opportunity to sell your product and have commercial success, that attracts money as well. So what my thesis is a bit, I hope that certain of these innovative companies, so don't think about startups who have no clue what they're doing yet. Think about companies that have already a product, that have some traction in their Western markets. What if they, instead of doing the traditional route of going international, go to their neighboring country? You know, a Swedish company thinking, let's go international, let's try Denmark, we've been there before, you know? Or, you know, or a Dutch company going to Belgium or a German company going to Switzerland. So what about, if you have the right technologies, to go to the areas where there's a real need and where really you could help? And on the other hand, what about the growing economies and people and investment firms or family offices or you know, or institutions there being willing to look to slightly younger companies? Not the standard multinational, you know, everybody, you won't get fired for kind of hiring IBM or say buying IBM. But what about if you're a bit more innovative and you try to take a bit more of a risk in that field? The technology should be proven, but they always need to be localized. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think, is can the growing economies leapfrog in technologies? And can the young companies, innovative companies from Europe or US, leapfrog quicker to these growing markets? That is something that is a bit of perhaps as an introduction, Joachim.
With the solutions and the technologies that companies can provide. And obviously you've mentioned the young companies instead of the multinational companies, which are first and foremost the main target for every country to attract and to seek as the savior of technology and to transfer this, which is an interesting view, and that's why I'd like to actually get the first question adapted to this view of the private sector, because in my opinion the government can learn a lot from experience in the private sector and from their needs. So what is actually the perspective that private investors have when they look at these opportunities in emerging markets? So what are they seeking? And I'd like to ask this first question to Mr. Francois Gilardino, who's founder and principal of Dumont LLC, and who's active in the venture capitalist business, working with private investors seeking opportunities. So please share us your view of what are your clients and the private companies are actually looking for in emerging markets, and which aspects might be the main barriers to actually engage them in these countries.
First of all, I would like to thank NASA and the organizer for inviting me here. I feel very privileged to be on this panel. I mainly work with startups, so high-tech ventures, disruptive technologies, and if we look at some figures coming from the World Bank, we know that in 20 years, energy consumption is going to increase by 35%, and more people would be looking for water. 85% would be lacking water. And I'm going to take two examples. One is dealing with a commodity trading, banks and corporates. And the other one with a very small startup. So there are two financial services. And in one case, we were able to raise a few millions to develop a kind of e-banking platform between banks and corporates. And we were really thinking in terms of innovation driven by necessity. And the innovation was to basically facilitate the exchange of information between banks and commodity trading companies. And I can come into more details into that. And the other one is basically a startups providing a solution for allowing the diaspora around the world to send money back home and have that as a conditional payment. So you put some money into the account, and then the money can be used for specific issues like health, education, and other things, or energy. So now if we look at the way we can help companies, two extremes. The first one, they can create the market. They have the money, they have the power, they have the connections, so it can be very easily done. And then it's basically thinking global and act locally as well, because it's highly dependent on regulations, the way you trade. And then we can see a lot of corporations investing into infrastructure so that they can secure the supply chain and the value chain locally. So they have to deal with, I would say, optimizing under constraints under these rules. And the other one was basically looking at a business case, and they develop an infrastructure. First, they apply that to microfinance institutions, and then they expanded that into micro credit, microfinance, microhealth, and these kind of things. But always, in our case, they came to our incubator. So we have a business incubator, and the state invests into our incubator, and then we help them basically to take off. And I think although the needs are very, very diverse, the impact is very, very diverse as well. But it's always looking at the global value chain, looking in which kind of funds you can tap into. if you're looking at private equity or pure venture capital, it's often a lot of money that is required when there is low risk. So what we do, we look at the process and we try to mitigate risks and ensure that we can get into funds or funding schemes where we can tap into European funds, African Development Bank funds, or other funds. But I think that what's key when I look at this technology and the role of the state in that is to have the empathy and understand the culture of the business as well where you want to deploy your technology. That's for me essential.
Risk is definitely a very important aspect of what you just mentioned, and how to minimize risk and to match these opportunities and to match the both parties on either side. So and touching on this, the private sector view, Kai Hamrich, who's former president of the Invest in Sweden agency, as well the World Association of Investment Promotion Agency, but also being a former executive vice president of Saab Scania. Certainly I would call it a multinational company. So what's your view on this in terms of what the private sector is doing in emerging economies and doing technology transfer?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. So we have heard some examples now from young companies. So I will approach this through the eyes of the multinational companies. These days, since yesterday, we have been discussing as regards transfer of technology, that is not only companies in the developed world investing in emerging economies, but also the other way around. And I will actually give two examples here. We know that China is a big outward investor, mainly in perhaps in Africa and South America, but actually also in as we know, in developed countries. And already in 2002, the biggest telecommunications company today, Huawei, invested in Sweden. 10, 12 years later, we have seen two automotive Chinese companies, Geely and Nevs, investing also in Sweden, buying first Volvo and then Saab. So, of course, the Chinese have done this because they want access to the technology existing in Sweden within automotive and telecommunications. And I'll say two words about Huawei, because they started, as I said, in 2002 with 5 to 10 people, with a R&D center. Today, they have got 500 people employed in Sweden. And when this investment first took place, as head of Invest in Sweden agency, I was quite criticized by Ericsson, because they said, how can you do this, and how can you invite and let a competitor coming into our home yard? And to the story belongs that in 2000, then Ericsson went through a very, very difficult crisis. So they laid off thousands of people. So what Huawei did, they tapped into that and employed talent. They employed the people laid off from Ericsson and started building their business. And then they have been growing. At that time, Ericsson was the biggest or the largest telecommunications operator in the world. Now it's Huawei. And of course, when I got all this criticism from Ericsson, I said, yes, you can see it from that point of view, but I mean, we have got an open economy. We are tapping into competence centers in the world, in other countries, so that's why we must also allow Huawei to come. And if we really want to be competitive in the future, then we have to have a cluster, and the cluster in Sweden should consist not only of Ericsson and suppliers to Ericsson, but of international players also, and that's why Huawei is welcome. So they have really built up a strong force with 500 people, as I said, today in Sweden and worldwide, thanks to the talent they have and the technology they have tapped into here.
let me quickly ask you a question on this and to challenge this thought a little, because you're now trying, you're saying the scaling of the multinational companies have a much larger impact on the local economy than what we were saying before, the young companies, for example. So if I understand you right, is your perspective attracting investments from multinational companies more of a higher value for technology transfer in a country than young companies? Or what's the target group for governments, if we get this, if we try to connect this to the main theme of what governments can do around attracting technology transfer investments? So what's the target group in the end?
Okay, Joachim, I think it's neither nor. It's actually both. And I think that it's extremely important to and that has been already elaborated upon, to attract young companies, talent, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is, you could say, a package. And during my time at Invest in Sweden agency, we really tried to attract both multinationals, small and medium-sized companies, individual talent of people who could fit into the clusters of excellence that we had, so to say. So this is really not, you should do that and that. You have really to do both things.
Okay, that's interesting.
The second, will you allow me to give the second case regarding Brazil? And I'll be short there, but this is a military contract, so it's a little special. But as we know, military technology is extremely advanced. And Sweden has got some very advanced fighter aircraft. Some already, when Lula was there, the process started for Brazil. They wanted to buy 36 fighter aircraft of the last generation of fighter aircraft. And it has taken 7, 8, or 8, 9 years. And last year, it was decided, the Brazilian government decided that Sweden got the order in competition with the French and the Americans. And that was quite a deal, because to get that order and by that winning it over the US and France for a small country like Sweden, because when it comes to military contracts, it's very much about politics. Anyway, what is interesting is that what they are buying into the Swedish cluster of military technology, investing in Sweden now, but then these aircraft will then be co-produced in Brazil. However, what is interesting in this deal, that is that Sweden, the Swedish government and Brazilian government, have done a partnership deal where where it has been decided that the next generation of fighter aircraft will be developed both in Sweden and Brazil. So Brazil, within the aviation industry, has already got a very, very strong capability and technology, a commercial one with Embraer. Now they will also get the military one, and thus become, in the years to come, a very, very strong nation within aviation. So I think this is it is, of course, we are talking about governments here, we are talking about multinationals, but here you see a case of transfer of technology, of the most advanced technology, and we are not only talking about fighter aircraft, but also about surveillance, electronics, telecommunications, and so on. So they are tapping into that. So this is an example of transfer of technology, partnership between a developed country and an emerging economy.
That's a very interesting example of what you provided, especially with the relationship between Europe and South America and Brazil in particular. And I would like to pass on the question of the role of the government to high-level representatives of investment promotion agencies here. It's Mr. Elafdil from Invest in Morocco, or AMDI, and on the other hand, Mr. Frasquillo, president of ICEP from Portugal. what is the role of investment promotion agencies in promoting technology transfer? You know, Morocco can really build on a huge success story of attracting automotive industry, particularly in the last year, and being at the next stage of development, I would call it. How is the IPA now supporting the creation of, I would say, an ecosystem of investors, and also to involve local businesses in this supply chain?
Thanks. أولا أود أن أقدم بالشكر الجزيل لمنظمي هذا اللقاء، وأشكر المنظمين على دعوتي أيضا للمشاركة في هذه الدورة التي سنعبر من خلالها على طبيعة الحال منظور المغرب فيما يتعلق بنقل البحث العلمي أو نقل الاختراعات في إطار تطوير الاستثمارات الخارجية داخل المملكة المغربية. وأود أن أقول قبل أن أجيب على سؤالكم بأن تصورنا في هذا المجال يرتبط بفهمنا العميق للتحدي الكبير الذي يمكن أن نسميه المدينة. المدن الآن في البلدان مثل المغرب والبلدان العربية والإسلامية بصفة عامة سيكون لها تأثير عميق على مجتمعاتنا إذا لم نتمكن من أن نطورها أو نتمكن من تطورها في المستقبل بطريقة متوازية وبطريقة تسمح لشعوبنا من الاستفادة من كافة الإمكانيات التي تمنحها المدن. وهذه التحديات التي جمعتها في تحدي المدينة يمكن تلخيصها في 5 نقاط. النقطة الأولى كما ذكر سابقا زميلي هنا هي الطاقة، فالمدن تحتاج إلى طاقة أكثر مما تحتاج إليه البوادي. النقطة الثانية هي الماء، وبطبيعة الحال تطور وإشكالية الماء ووجود الماء بكميات يتوافق مع النمو البشري الذي تعرفه بلداننا بطبيعة الحال يكون من التحديات الكبرى أيضا. التحدي الثالث هو الأمن الغذائي، وبطبيعة الحال نعرف جميعا أن تطور المدن يجعل بطبيعة الحال يعني مسألة الأمن الغذائي تطرح نظرا لأن الأراضي التي كانت زراعية ستحول إلى أراضي للمدن، وبالتالي سيكون هناك تساؤل مهم جدا فيما يتعلق بالأمن الغذائي وإشكاليات مرتبطة بالأمن الغذائي. النقطة الرابعة أو المحور الرابع هو التلوث، وهذه مسألة بطبيعة الحال تضر صحة الساكنة، وبالتالي لها آثار عميقة على المجتمعات، ولازم أن نهتم بها أيضا فيما يتعلق بالبحث العلمي. وبطبيعة الحال النقطة الخامسة هي تطور العمران أو البناء، وهذه هي المحاور ال5 التي نعتقد بأنها محاور استراتيجية فيما يتعلق بالبحث العلمي أو فيما يتعلق أيضا بتطوير الكفاءات في البحث والتطور. إذن الماء، الطاقة، البناء، التلوث والأمن الغذائي. كيف تعاملنا مع هذه الإشكاليات في المغرب كبلد من البلدان الواعدة؟ بطبيعة الحال فيما يتعلق بالطاقة، المغرب كانت له استراتيجية في تطوير الطاقة البديلة، سواء كانت الطاقة الشمسية أو الطاقة الهوائية. فالمغرب كما تعلمون رغم أنه بلد عربي فلا يمتلك مخزون من البترول، وهذه بطبيعة الحال كان يمكن أن نعتبرها فقط يعني حالة، لكن اعتبرناها أيضا تحدي، وبالتالي وضعت استراتيجية وخطة محكمة لتطوير الطاقات البديلة، سواء فيما يتعلق بالطاقة الشمسية أو الطاقة الهوائية أو الطاقة المائية. فسأتطرق فقط للطاقة الشمسية حتى يعني نرى كيفية تطوير البحث العلمي وتحويل الكفاءات التكنولوجية من البلدان التي تكتسبها إلى البلدان التي تود استعمالها، ولكن استعمال ذكي واستعمال في تطويرها أيضا، وليس فقط استعمالها كمستهلك. ففي هذا الإطار وضعت بطبيعة الحال أنشئ مركز للأبحاث في الطاقة الشمسية متخصص في الطاقة الشمسية إيرزان، وهذا المركز بطبيعة الحال ممول من طرف صندوق مخصص لتطوير الطاقة الشمسية، وله علاقة بمشاريع الطاقة الشمسية التي تعرفونها أنها مهمة جدا في المغرب، والمغرب يرتقب أن يطور أكثر من 2000 ميجاوات في هذا المجال. ولم تكن هناك خيارات موحدة في هذه أو واحدة في هذا الإطار، بل اختيارات مرحلية تبدأ بأولا تطوير استغلال تكنولوجيات موجودة، ثم بعد ذلك في المراحل المقبلة يعني الآن هناك 350 ميجاوات التي هي في طور الإنجاز، ما هو آت بالتالي سيدمج في تطوير هذه الطاقات البحث العلمي المرتبط بهذه الطاقات بهذه العلوم مع بطبيعة الحال الشركاء. وهنا أود أن أذكر شريك من المنطقة وهو أكوا السعودي الذي بطبيعة الحال دخل في هذا الإطار ليس فقط لتطوير معمل لتوليد الطاقة الشمسية، ولكن أيضا لتطوير البحث العلمي وتحويل التكنولوجيا إلى المغرب. هناك قطاع آخر مهم جدا وهو قطاع الفلاحي، ولن أذكر جميع القطاعات ولكن فقط أريد أن أذكر بعض القطاعات. القطاع الفلاحي كما تعلمون جيدا فالمغرب بلد فلاحي يعني له كفاءات وله إمكانيات لتطوير الفلاحة، والمغرب يصدر كمية هائلة من المنتوج الفلاحي إلى مجموعة من الدول وخاصة أوروبا وأمريكا وهنا أيضا في الخليج. لكن السؤال المطروح والذي طرح بطريقة موضوعية وبطريقة جدية أيضا في المخطط المغربي الأخضر، وهو كيف يمكن أن نستفيد من هذا المخطط الذي له أهداف فيما تتعلق بتطوير الإنتاجية الفلاحية، كيف يمكن أن نستغل هذا المخطط لتطوير أيضا البحث العلمي في الزراعة وتحويل التكنولوجيات من البلدان ومن المستثمرين الأجانب إلى المغرب. وهناك عدة مراكز وعدة معاهد في المغرب، أذكر منها بالخصوص معهد الزراعي المتواجد بمدينة الرباط الذي يكون منذ سنوات عدة مهندسين، والآن طور تكنولوجيات مرتبطة بنبتات يعني بفصائل من الزراعات التي تصبر وتتطور أيضا في المناخ المغربي الذي هو مناخ ليس هو صيفي ولكن هو مناخ يتغير من منطقة إلى منطقة، وأيضا تطوير فصائل نوعية لا تستهلك المياه كثيرا، وبطبيعة الحال تطوير تكنولوجيات لاستغلال المياه بطريقة ترشيد استغلال المياه. وهذه كلها يعني وسائل التي وضعت في إطار استراتيجية موحدة تدعم من طرف الدولة، بحيث أن هناك صندوق الحسن الثاني من بين الوسائل التي وضعت في هذا الصندوق هي تمويل البحث العلمي أو تمويل بعض التكنولوجيات لكي نتمكن من استقطابها إلى المعاهد المغربية وإلى الجامعات المغربية.
Thank you very much. This example of what you just mentioned on the agricultural industry in Morocco is quite interesting. Actually, we've had the chance to work with an Austrian company that's active in the fruit business, in the red fruits, and they're just regularly, planting red fruits, shock frosting, and exporting to Europe. Then they had a project where they really were adding some value locally, and not only shock frosting and exporting, but processing the fruits into mush, which will then be distributed to dairy companies, large dairy companies. So you really have the added value of a project which a foreign company adds when adding new processing technology, which is in the agriculture business quite an interesting aspect. You want to say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
أريد فقط أن أضيف بأن بطبيعة الحال بالإضافة إلى ما ذكرت هناك أيضا فيما يتعلق بالتطوير يعني التكنولوجيات الحديثة في الأسمدة. عندنا مشروع شركة مهمة جدا من السويس طورت مشروع مهم في منطقة من المغرب يعني يستفيد من طبيعة الحال المنتوج المغربي الفوسفات وتطويره بطريقة علمية إلى أسمدة تخص بعض المنتجات التي نطورها في المغرب، ليس فقط المنتوج النهائي بل أيضا المنتوجات أو الأسمدة التي تستغل في الزراعة. وتحدثت عن هذه المواضيع لأن ممكن أن تظهر بأنها ليست أهم مما ذكرت من قبل في قطاع السيارات، أو ممكن أن أرجع فيما بعد إذا أردت إلى قطاع الطيران، صناعة الطائرات التي عندنا فيها قطاع متطور جدا، وأيضا فيه يعني طورنا علاقات مع هذه الشركات العالمية لكي تحول بعد البحوث العلمية أو التكنولوجيات الحديثة، علما بأن الداعم الأساسي لهذا كله هو سياسة حماية البراءة الاختراعية التي هي في الحقيقة من الدعائم التي طورها المغرب منذ عدة سنوات. وهي الآن المغرب له اتفاقيات مع مكتب البراءات الاختراعية في أوروبا، بحيث أن أي اختراع في المغرب يسجل في المغرب يحتمى في جميع أوروبا والعكس أيضا. وهذه مسألة مهمة جدا لأن الشركات العالمية لا تعتمد على هذه الأبحاث أو على التكنولوجيات كأسط، يعني هو أصل الموارد، وبالتالي يجب أن يحمى من طرف القوانين المحلية.
Great addition to this point, and actually I would like to pass on the same question and your view to Portugal, and how is Portugal trying to create this ecosystem between foreign companies and then involving also local business, which I think is crucial in generating own businesses in the country.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here at this annual investment meeting. I would also like to start by saying that I was delighted to hear our guest speaker talking about Portugal, mentioning Portugal in his speech. It was great. And I would say that the agency, ICEP, which is the Trade and Investment Agency of Portugal, which I'm chairman and CEO, we have been, one of our focus is, of course, the attraction of FDI. I would say that our task has been, for the last years, more and more easy because Portugal has overcome the adjustment, has recovered credibility. Internationally, we have corrected imbalances both on fiscal terms, external deficit, which as a matter of fact is a surplus, not a deficit anymore. And we have also begun a set of structural reforms in order to create a very attractive environment for investors. And for the last 3 to 4 years, and I think that is starting to pay. Because we have seen some very interesting investments in Portugal. I would mention some big investments, but we are also very interested, of course, in small and medium companies. But for the last years, we have seen investments, for instance, from Germany, and also from the technology sector, like Volkswagen, like Bosch, from the US, Microsoft. From Brazil, Embraer in the aeronautical sector, then with some other sectors like Chinese investments from China Three Gorges, from State Grid, from Fosun, from, then again, technology Huawei in the Research and Development Center, from the region of the Gulf, Oman Oil, from France, Altis and Vinci. And I think that when Portugal started to climb and recover in terms of competitiveness in the rankings, in the international competitiveness rankings, that was really great because I think the whole world looks at these rankings. And in the last year, we climbed 15 positions from number 51 to number 36 in terms of the World Economic Forum, just to give you one example. And in terms of FDI and technology, I think it's very important that Portugal ranks 14 in terms of technology transfer in FDI. That's out of 144 countries. For instance, in the technology absorption firm level, Portugal ranks 22, again out of 144 countries, and in the availability of new technologies, Portugal ranks 11 in terms of 144 countries. So this is helping our task a lot. But we are also very, we think, even though we have made some progress and that we are building a very favorable environment for investors, not only in the labor market, also in justice, also in bureaucracy and licensing, in tax policy. We are reducing the corporate income tax heavily, up to 17% in 2018. We are having a new tax code for investments, which can provide savings up to 25% of the investment that is made, and very good conditions for startup companies. Also, in the new European structural funds framework, in which financial incentives can be done and can be given to innovation, to research and development, to internationalization of companies, and also to technology sector, up to 10 billion euros for the next 5 years. Those are really interesting amounts, and I think that Portugal is clearly back in the roadmap of international investment. But as an agency to promote, so we are, of course, when we mention this, we are being helped by the homework we have done for the last years, but we want more. We want to be more close to investors. And in the technology sector, it's just the same. And this is why we will be opening a branch in San Francisco. Because we want to be near one of the most powerful, like Silicon Valley in terms of technology. We need to be there. We want to be there. It's not conceivable that we are not there. Because if we are not near those centers, it is not. It will be much harder to attract whatever it is and to promote our country. But again, with actions like this one, we have also created the figure of FDI scouts, which means specialists in the attraction of investment, which will be focused in some regions of the world where our analysis provided there's a lot of room for us to improve the relationship between investors and our country. One of the regions is, of course, the US, as I mentioned, like the San Francisco, but a lot of Asia and also some European countries where investment can come more to Portugal. We think this is absolutely crucial in order to sustain the growth of exports, in which we are also very, very, very focused, and where we have had for the last years a very interesting evolution, a recovery. Our exports present now roughly 40% of GDP, but that compares 5 years ago with roughly 26 to 27%, so a big improvement. We need to go to sustain that path. We need to go further, and we can only do that by attracting FDI, quality FDI, technology FDI, that can transfer knowledge to Portugal, that can create jobs, that can create wealth. And we will be very focused on that. I can tell you that from this year and next year, we will be very, very focused in this task, because for a small open economy like Portugal, internationalization is the way, and the way it can be sustained is with FDI. And the FDI that can create more value added, which is exactly this technology sector.
So we've seen quite a few views on how private companies are actually looking at the topic of technology transfer, and on the other hand, how governments are looking at it, how to attract, and finally, we actually come to the point where there's more than just government and companies involved, but certainly academia and education is playing a most important role in connecting the dots. So Lisa Cook, Associate Professor of Economics from Michigan State University, Being in the academic world, what's your view and how do you think you can generate a vivid interrelationship between companies, academia, accelerators as well, which is important, and certainly government across borders?
Okay, thank you, Joachim. So I would also like to thank Naja and the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to participate on this prestigious panel and this really important conversation. So I think I carry the perspective of the government and of academia, and as a person who started an enterprise at age 17. So I think that this is a critical time to talk about this. I think there are two things that governments can do to help with this kind of FDI that is needed. So first of all, creating an environment that is conducive to protecting intellectual property. So that's my research. So I'm speaking from what I know and know specifically. I think that you can't get around, especially if you want the kind of FDI that is being talked about, the kind that involves tech transfer, if the environment for intellectual property protection is not there. The second thing is a longer term thing, and that is that you have to create educational systems that involve experimentation, that allow and foster creativity. One of the problems that professors have, and this is for engineering, this is for economics, this is for all of our graduate students, when they come from countries that suppress experimentation, that promote rote learning, when they get to the dissertation phase, when they actually have to make a contribution to the literature, they have to be creative, we lose them. They become panicked and they become lost. That's a metaphor for the entire economy. We can't look at education as something that is memorized, but something that fosters creativity and involves experimentation. Our students who do best come from those environments. And I'm not just talking about at the dissertation stage. I mean, I'm not just talking about graduate students, but in general, those who come from economies that have creativity in the background, and promoting creativity in the background are some of the best ones. Finally, I think that governments can help companies think about adopting appropriate technologies. We think about literacy in a hierarchical kind of way. How can literacy be taught, or how can numeracy be taught? Well, in places that don't have the technology to be able to do this, lots of teachers, lots of classrooms, maybe mobile phones are the way to do it. We have to think about the technologies we actually have that are being proliferated rather than the classic textbook that has been available. I think those are ways that governments can be involved with firms and with the private sector generally to foster the kind of environment that is necessary.
Great. I think, conscious of time, we still have a few minutes, but I would like to use the last couple of minutes, and maybe you can immediately move on with this topic and get some discussion on the cultural aspect of technology transfer and FDI going, because I mean, we see multiple examples of deal opportunities on collaboration across countries, and if it stays at an abstract level, it sounds in theory all great and it all works out, but in the end it's different people involved from different cultures. So how can you actually bridge the cultural gap that sometimes can hamper a certain development, but also foster it on the other hand, right, if you put together the right people. So how do you match interests from different cultural backgrounds in order to create a win-win situation?
So I have two views on this. First of all, the U.S., just like any other country, can't do business as usual. By 2040, minorities are going to be the majority. So this cultural gap that we talk about is going to become real. And diversity has to be embraced in that sense. So the U.S., just like every other country, cannot take diversity for granted. So that's the first answer. The second for me answer is from my research. So one thing that I found in my research is that on patent teams is that diverse teams are much more productive than homogeneous teams. So having that cultural gap is costly. So people have different experiences. We know from the empirical literature, people have different experiences. They bring them to patent teams, to design teams. And the way you can foster this kind of development is to make sure that this cultural gap is closed. It will be inefficient. Patent teams and design teams can't compete if they don't embrace this kind of cultural diversity, this kind of diversity more generally. Gender diversity, cultural diversity, all kinds of diversity.
Is there another view on this or additional? Please go.
Yes, one view could be that talking about cultural divergences and so on, that is that I think that when we are talking about investments both way, inward, outward, FDI, then what we need to see, especially if we want these investments to have a technological contents, that is much more partnerships. Partnerships between countries in the developed world and developing worlds. And there, of course, you see that it's not only a question of education and many other things, but markets, but also of these cultural differences that you have to manage in one way or the other if you are to realize a very good partnership. As we have seen it, and I can mention it, for example, with the because I mentioned that before, with the Chinese in Sweden. They are extremely clever, doing a good job within the cluster of telecommunications. But, however, there is a cultural difficulty because they stick very much to themselves. They don't integrate that easily. So there we have to try to overbridge as much as we can, but that demands a very an effort. Because if you don't make that effort, then you will get you will not get partnerships, but you will get investments which tend to could be a little isolated, and they are not good for the future.
Yes.
I think one of the nice benefits of trying to transfer technologies and knowledge in the deals that I've all seen, it forces people to sit down together, and to forces people to understand what's your problem, what's your product. And actually, one of the nice benefits that I find of it, that you have to learn the other cultures. And Lisa said it actually helps in the end, but you go through a huge hurdle. I mean, even in Europe, we have all kind of cultural differences. I mean, usually if the French talk about marketing, they only talk about PR. You know, if I live in Switzerland, people are typically on time. All these things. But the very interesting point I find, and it's a bit more stepping back, I think in the end the world will be a much better place if we talk more. And in the end, it's start talking about what problem you have and what great value you have. You know, start first. I think we should start making, start to trade. And when you start trading with each other, you start to respect each other. And when you slowly start respecting each other, what you'll see, that you see interracial, intercultural marriages, and people start even getting more respect for the cultures. So I think through the route of technology and sharing that technology, I think we'll do a bit more than only helping both sides of the cultural transfer, but also helping a bit more better understanding. For G, that's interesting what they do there. Or G, we can help them.
Mr. Gilardino, short comment again?
I would say I think the most important thing for a venture capitalist is to say to our companies, know your customers. And I listened to what you said about smart cities and these kind of things. We have sometimes amazing innovations we can find in North Africa. Like we have seen examples in Masdar, the way they use the architecture to cool down the city. We have seen that in Algeria, for instance, the way they cool down things, new materials. And I think that people have to look at globally, all this global knowledge, what has been done over the centuries of knowledge and then tends to disappear. Also, I think that when I say know your customers, if I just quickly mention, I was attending the WFES in Abu Dhabi early this year, and a company called M-Pesa providing off-grid energy. they were just amazed and surprised by how quickly they were able to sell, because they provided a technology, simple technology that was fulfilling a need. So I think we have to think in terms of enabling technologies and not as technologies, because we have to think in terms of integrated projects. You're mentioning food supply. What's the impact on waste? What's the impact on water? And those kind of things. And I think that in terms of investment, just to conclude, there is money to be made everywhere, but we have to think, we have to have this global picture, but really look locally and know the customers, know the cultures, and all that. And the last examples really I want to say is M-Pesa. It's a system that was used to deploy in Kenya to pay. The technology has been taken to other countries in Africa. It didn't work because people did not understand the culture. And I think it's very, very important. Technology per se has no value. I think it has to be put into a global value chain, and especially really understand the way people attract and will use it.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add, just confirming the words of Professor Eliza D. Cook here, that education is of course absolutely important for this, not only to attract FDI, but especially in the most developed sectors of FDI, like the technology and the transfer of this technology. And it is really important when you look, let me again talk about Portugal, and when you see that, for instance, more than 60% of the Portuguese population speak at least one foreign language. Some 80% of the students learn 2 or more foreign language, and English is mandatory from elementary school. And that is clearly above the European average. Not to mention, in terms of the quality of management of schools, Portugal ranks top in not only in European terms, but in global terms. The availability of scientists and engineers is really high. We are very competitive in this area, and again, the quality of scientific research. Portugal ranks very, very good in international terms. I didn't mention this a few moments earlier, but I think this is really important, because it, in the end, if you don't have the human resources that are essential to develop the tasks you need, then you'll need to qualify them. Of course, we need to qualify more, but on an international basis, we compare very well, and we think this is also a factor that comes in our favor when it comes to attract FDI.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the insightful contribution to this discussion. Just quickly wrapping this up, we started out with the private sector, which certainly plays a crucial role in this technology transfer, and which is obviously quite diversified, starting with startup companies, young companies, but also multinational companies, creating the target group for investments and technology transfer, and then certainly the government playing a crucial role in connecting the people, in overcoming also cultural gaps through partnerships, obviously, and the academia and the education system being the fundament for the developments within emerging economies. So let me all thank you, and annual investment meeting for the honor to moderate this panel at this point, and thank you for the audience to listen. Thank you.